My name is Camille. I am 35 years old and the absolute backbone of my family logistics empire. Or at least I was. Last Tuesday, I was called into the glass-walled human resources conference room. My brother's new wife slid a piece of paper across the cold mahogany table and crossed her arms. "We know you have been working 2 jobs on company time, Camille," she said with a triumphant smirk. "You are terminated effective immediately." I did not argue. I did not beg or shed a single tear. I simply picked up the pen, signed the paper, and smiled. "You are right, Chloe," I told her. "I really should focus on my other job." They had absolutely no idea what that other job was. But they were about to find out because the clock had just started ticking on a 7-5-hour countdown that would destroy everything they thought they owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your hard work taken for granted by the very people you were keeping afloat. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, the family business was the center of our entire universe. My parents, Vivian and Jerome, built their freight and logistics firm from a single delivery truck into a regional powerhouse. But building an empire and sustaining one are 2 fundamentally different things. For the past decade, I was the one working 80 hours a week analyzing supply chain algorithms, negotiating complex freight contracts, and keeping the company from drowning in a rapidly changing industry. I sacrificed my 20s and half of my 30s to ensure our parents' legacy did not crumble under the weight of their own outdated business practices and poor financial management. Meanwhile, my younger brother Jamal was the golden child. At 32 years old, he was recently handed the title of vice president, simply for sharing our parents' DNA and being their only son, Lee. His grueling weekly schedule consisted of Tuesday morning golf games, extended networking lunches that produced 0 clients, and leaving the office by 3:00 inches the afternoon on a good day. Yet, here I was, sitting in the coldest room in the building, staring at my own termination papers. The sheer irony of the situation tasted bitter in the back of my throat. Chloe, my brother's white wife of barely 6 months, sat directly across from me. Her appointment as human resources director was my parents' extravagant wedding gift to the happy couple, despite the fact that she had absolutely 0 background in corporate logistics, personnel management, or anything remotely related to our field. Now, she was glaring at me with a practiced corporate severity that she had undoubtedly rehearsed in her bathroom mirror that morning. Jamal leaned casually against the glass doorframe, adjusting the cuffs of a custom-tailored suit paid for by the profit margins I had personally secured during the previous quarter. "We ran a comprehensive background audit," Camille, Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial professionalism. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped the termination letter resting on the polished wood between us. "We know you have been moonlighting. We have undeniable proof that you are dedicating company time to another corporate entity. This is a direct violation of your employment contract and a blatant breach of trust to this family." I looked from the printed letter to Chloe and then shifted my gaze to my brother. Jamal offered a subtle, self-satisfied smirk. "The accusation was that I was stealing company time." "Me? The woman who had missed her own best friend's wedding last year because 3 of our primary shipping routes had frozen due to a sudden union strike, and I was the only one who knew how to reroute the freight. The woman who routinely answered crisis calls from panicked long-haul drivers at 3 inches the morning while Jamal was sound asleep in his luxury townhouse. I was the senior operations director in title, but in reality I was the sole engine keeping the entire machine moving forward while they took all the credit. Jamal finally pushed himself off the doorframe and stepped further into the room. His expensive cologne was suffocating, acting as a heavy scent that announced his arrival long before he actually contributed anything of value to a conversation. "It is about loyalty, Camille," he said, pacing slowly behind Chloe's chair like a predator circling prey. "You have shown a complete and utter disregard for the family legacy. Mom and Dad trusted you to help me run this place, and instead you are funneling your energy into some hidden side hustle. It is an embarrassment. Frankly, it is a disgrace to everything our parents built from the ground up." I remained perfectly still, resting my hands in my lap. I watched him posture, recognizing the exact brand of arrogant incompetence that had driven the firm's margins into the ground whenever I was not looking over his shoulder to fix his mistakes. "Because of your gross negligence," Jamal continued, his voice swelling with unearned authority, "I am officially taking over the operations division, effective immediately. I will be handling the routing protocols, the vendor negotiations, and the fleet management. We need a leader who is fully committed to this company. We need someone who actually cares about the future of this brand." The sheer audacity of his statement was almost breathtaking. Jamal taking over operations was akin to handing the keys of a commercial airplane to someone who had only ever flown a paper kite. He did not know the difference between a freight forwarder and a third-party logistics provider. He had absolutely no concept of the delicate predictive algorithms that calculated our fuel efficiency across state lines. He knew nothing about the complex, fragile relationships I had spent years cultivating with warehouse managers and union representatives across the Southeast. He was stepping into a highly technical role that required precision, relentless dedication, and an intimate understanding of global supply chains. He possessed none of those traits. He only possessed an inflated ego and the blind backing of our parents. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she tried to establish her dominance in the small room. "We are going to need your company laptop, your security badge, and your master keys right now, Camille," she demanded. She spoke to me as if I were a hostile threat, a common criminal caught stealing office supplies from the supply closet. "If you refuse to comply or attempt to access any company data from this moment forward, I will have security physically escort you out of the building. We will not hesitate to involve law enforcement if you make this difficult." I let her threatening words hang in the empty air of the conference room. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my 10 years of blood, sweat, and tears. I did not point out that the laptop she was so aggressively demanding contained the only functional financial models keeping our upcoming quarterly projections afloat. I just sat there and observed the two of them. They were so incredibly eager to push me out, so desperate to claim the throne and prove their superiority, that they had not stopped for a single second to consider what actually held the castle up. They wanted the title and the prestige of running the company without doing a fraction of the actual labor required to sustain it. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my lips. It was not a laugh of hysteria or heartbreak, but one of pure, unadulterated clarity. The sound seemed to unnerve them both instantly. Chloe's posture stiffened defensively, and Jamal crossed his arms tight against his chest. I reached into my tailored blazer pocket and pulled out my own sleek fountain pen. I leaned over the mahogany table and pulled the termination paperwork directly toward me. I read the clauses quickly, but thoroughly analyzing every legal implication. They were firing me without any documented cause relating to my actual performance, explicitly stating my termination was due to unapproved outside employment. By classifying my dismissal this way and refusing to offer a proper severance package in their haste to get rid of me, they were effectively and legally nullifying my non-compete agreement. The sheer legal ignorance of their human resources strategy was staggering. Chloe had handed me the exact legal loophole I needed on a silver platter without even realizing what she had done. With smooth, deliberate strokes, I signed the document. I placed my security badge and the heavy ring of master keys right on top of the paper. I reached down to my leather briefcase, pulled out the company laptop, and set it gently beside them. I stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my skirt, and looked Chloe dead in the eye. "You are right, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly level and terrifyingly calm. "I really should focus on my other job." I did not wait for a response from either of them. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass-walled conference room, leaving them standing there in confused silence. I walked purposefully past the rows of cubicles filled with employees who were desperately trying to look busy, pretending they had not just watched the only competent director in the entire building get ambushed and fired. I did not stop at my spacious corner office to pack a single box. The personal items on my desk, the framed professional photos, the expensive leather desk organizer, the custom coffee mug, they were just material things. They did not matter to me anymore. I was leaving the dead weight behind. I stepped into the executive elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the heavy metal doors slid shut, cutting off my view of the family business, I had literally given my youth to save. The internal countdown began in my mind. 75 hours. In exactly 75 hours, our logistics company, the one Jamal was now supposedly running single-handedly, was scheduled to sit down for the most critical corporate acquisition meeting in its entire history. The family business was quietly drowning in massive commercial debt, a dark financial reality my parents were desperately trying to hide from the public and their employees. Their only salvation, their only hope of avoiding total bankruptcy and ruin, was a highly anticipated buyout from a massive, faceless corporate holding company. It was a complex, lucrative deal. I had personally structured, a deal I had nurtured for 6 months, and a deal they believed would make them richer and more powerful than ever before. They thought they had just secured their kingdom by getting rid of the only person holding them accountable. They thought they could simply step into my shoes, take credit for my logistical architecture, and ride my coattails to a multi-million-dollar payday while leaving me unemployed and disgraced. They had absolutely no idea that by firing me, they had just initiated their own spectacular destruction. They had no idea who was really pulling the strings of their salvation from the shadows. And as the elevator reached the ground floor and I walked out the sliding glass doors into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight, I felt lighter and more powerful than I had in 10 years. The countdown was ticking loud and clear. 75 hours until everything they thought they knew went up in flames. And I was going to be the one holding the match. 4 hours later, I was sitting on the velvet sofa in my own living room, watching the Atlanta traffic crawl along the highway far below my window. I had just poured myself a glass of sparkling water, savoring the absolute silence of a phone that was not currently ringing with supply chain emergencies or panicked warehouse managers. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace. Then my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table, shattering the quiet. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Vivian. I let the phone vibrate 3 times, watching the screen glow before I finally answered. Vivian did not ask how my day was. She did not ask if I was okay. Her voice came through the speaker with the crisp, commanding tone she usually reserved for unruly vendors and wait staff. "Camille, we are having a mandatory family dinner tonight at 8, she announced. "Do not be late. We have important family matters to discuss." She hung up the phone before I could even formulate a reply. There was no mention of my firing. There was no shocked gasp of "I just heard what Chloe did." There was only a cold, authoritative summons. In the past, a call like that would have sent a spike of anxiety straight through my chest. I would have spent the drive over wondering if they were calling to console me or if I was about to be burned for letting Chloe disrespect me. Now, I just felt a cold, analytical curiosity. I wanted to see the performance. I wanted to look my parents in the eye and see exactly how deep the rot of their betrayal actually went. I did not bother changing out of my tailored suit. I grabbed my keys, walked down to the parking garage, and drove my car toward the wealthy estates of Buckhead. The drive to my parents' home was a route I had taken hundreds of times over the last decade, usually while on a Bluetooth headset, fighting with customs agents to clear our international shipments. The estate itself was a sprawling, pristine monument to the sheer amount of money I had personally generated for them. Wrought iron gates opened to a massive circular driveway, lined with perfectly manicured oak trees and imported landscaping. Jerome's classic Mercedes and Jamal's brand-new Range Rover sat parked near the grand entrance, gleaming under the expensive security lights. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy double doors. I did not bother knocking. I still had my key to the house, a house I had essentially paid the mortgage on for the last 5 years, when their reckless personal spending habits and Jerome's bad investments nearly bankrupted the family firm. The moment I stepped into the grand marble foyer, the sound of clinking glass and raucous laughter echoed from the formal dining room down the hall. The rich scent of roasted garlic, rosemary, and expensive catering filled the air. This was not a somber family gathering assembled to address a sudden professional crisis. This was a party. I walked silently across the marble floor toward the arched doorway of the dining room and stopped just out of sight, pressing my back against the wall. The scene playing out before me was like something meticulously staged for a theater production. The long mahogany dining table was fully set with Vivian's finest crystal stemware and the heavy imported silver she only brought out for major holidays and galas. My mother was seated at one end of the long table, wearing a vibrant silk blouse and a smile so wide it looked almost painful. At the head of the table stood my father, Jerome. He was holding a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne, his chest puffed out with absolute patriarchal pride. And there, sitting directly on his right, were Jamal and Chloe. Chloe looked incredibly relaxed, leaning back in her upholstered chair and sipping her champagne with the smug satisfaction of a cat that had just swallowed a canary. Jamal was beaming, soaking up the heavy adoration radiating from our parents like a sponge. The realization hit me with the blunt force of a physical blow, though my face remained perfectly impassive in the shadows. They were not surprised that I was fired. They were not waiting to hear my side of the story or demanding answers from Chloe. They had orchestrated the entire thing. Chloe did not have the corporate authority to unilaterally terminate a senior operations director without executive approval. Jamal did not have the operational power to seize my division on a whim. They needed the company founders to sign off on the paperwork. My parents had handed Chloe the loaded gun, pointed her directly at my head, and given her the explicit order to pull the trigger. I stood completely still in the quiet of the foyer, my heart slowing down into a steady, rhythmic beat. I was watching my own family celebrate my professional execution. "Everyone, please." Jerome's booming voice echoed through the dining room, cutting through the sound of their shared laughter. He raised his champagne flute higher, the faceted crystal catching the warm light from the massive chandelier hanging above them. "I want to propose a toast to the table." Vivian clapped her hands together lightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy as she looked adoringly at Jamal. "Today marks a brilliant new era for our family and for our legacy," Jerome announced, his voice vibrating with deep pride. "For too long, our operations have been bogged down by a lack of true vision and rigid, outdated thinking. But today, we took the necessary steps to correct that course. We trimmed the fat. We removed the obstacles blocking our path to greatness." He was talking about me, his own daughter, the woman who had given up her personal life, missed vacations, and sacrificed her own relationships to keep him out of federal bankruptcy court. He stood in the house my labor had paid for and called me an obstacle. So Jerome continued, turning his proud gaze entirely onto his son. "I want us all to raise a glass to Jamal, to his official takeover of the operations division. You are stepping up exactly as a strong son should. You are taking your rightful place, taking the reins of this empire and guiding this family into a prosperous future. To Jamal, our new head of operations." To Jamal, Vivian echoed her voice, practically singing with delight. "To Jamal," Chloe chimed in, leaning over to kiss his cheek intimately. They clinked their glasses together over the center of the table. The sound was sharp and clear, ringing through the dining room like a death knell to my past life. They drank the champagne, laughing cheerfully, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just destroyed my career, my income, and my livelihood. Less than 4 hours ago, they genuinely believed I was currently sitting alone in my apartment, crying over my lost job, and panicking about how I was going to pay my bills. They believed they had successfully excised a tumor from their perfect lives, leaving the path totally clear for their golden boy to shine without his older sister casting a shadow over his mediocrity. They thought they had won. Had I watched them for a few seconds longer, memorizing the look of absolute joy on my parents' faces as they toasted to my orchestrated downfall, I cataloged the sheer unearned entitlement radiating from my brother's posture. I noted the vicious territorial satisfaction gleaming in Chloe's eyes. I let the harsh reality of their ultimate betrayal sink deep into my bones, allowing it to harden into something cold, calculating, and utterly unbreakable. Then I stepped out of the shadows of the foyer and walked directly into the bright light of the dining room. "Please do not let me interrupt the celebration," I said, my voice cutting through their laughter like a serrated blade. The champagne flutes froze in midair. The joyous laughter that had filled the dining room snapped shut, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Chloe's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, nervous line across her face. Jamal actually flinched, spilling a few drops of his expensive vintage champagne onto the polished mahogany table. "My mother," Vivian gasped sharply, her hand flying to her chest as if my mere presence in my own childhood home was a physical assault. Jerome was the only one who recovered quickly. He lowered his crystal flute, setting it down on the table with a heavy, deliberate thud. He did not look ashamed. He did not look caught. He simply looked annoyed that his perfectly orchestrated evening had been interrupted by the casualty of his business decisions. "Camille," he said, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "We did not expect you to arrive quite so early. I told you 8. "Clearly," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "The executioner usually waits for the body to get cold before throwing a party. I suppose I ruined the element of surprise." "Sit down, Camille," Jerome commanded, pointing to an empty chair at the far end of the table. "Stop being dramatic and sit down so we can discuss this like adults." I did not move. I remained standing in the arched doorway, towering over their seated celebration. "I prefer to stand," I said. "You summoned me here, Jerome. You fired me 4 hours ago using a fabricated human resources audit, and now you want to have a family discussion. So, let us discuss. Tell me why I am here." Jerome sighed heavily, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He dropped the corporate facade completely. The professional jargon about unauthorized moonlighting and company policy evaporated. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who viewed his children strictly as assets and liabilities. "Let us be honest with each other, Camille," he began. You are a smart woman. You know, the company is going through a transitional phase. We are positioning ourselves for a massive corporate buyout. The optics of our executive board need to reflect strong traditional leadership. Jamal is taking over operations because the buyers need to see the son stepping up to lead the family business. It projects stability. It projects legacy. I stared at him, letting his ridiculous justification hang in the air. Optics, I repeated. You fired your senior operations director, the only person who actually understands your supply chain to improve your optics. Jamal needs your office, Jerome stated bluntly, leaning back in his chair. He needs the corner suite to project authority to the board of directors and to the clients. He cannot lead the division from a junior office. And frankly, he needs your salary budget. We are reallocating your 6F-figure compensation package into his new vice president compensation plan. The sheer audacity of his words echoed in the quiet dining room. They did not just want my job. They wanted the literal physical space I occupied and the money I earned through 10 years of 8 zero-hour work weeks. They were stripping me down to the studs to build a pedestal for Jamal. Before I could even respond to the sheer financial theft, my father had just casually admitted to Vivian decided to deliver the fatal blow. She set her champagne glass down and looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound disappointment. You have to understand our position, Camille, she said, her jewelry clanking softly against the table. Jamal is starting a family. At those words, Chloe placed a delicate, highly manicured hand over her perfectly flat stomach. She looked up at me with a triumphant, glowing smile. The golden child was producing a golden grandchild. Vivian continued weaponizing my entire existence. You are 35 years old, Camille. You are single. You do not have a husband to support you. You do not have children to provide for. You live alone in a luxury apartment downtown. What do you even need all that money for? The words struck me with the precision of a sniper bullet. It was the ultimate patriarchal double standard distilled into a single toxic breath. My 10 years of blood, sweat, and relentless dedication meant absolutely nothing because I was not a mother or a wife. I was just a barren workhorse to them. I was a temporary placeholder, an employee they had utilized to keep the lights on until their precious prince was ready to claim his throne and start his royal family. Jamal is building a legacy. Vivian pressed on her voice, growing firmer as she justified their betrayal. He carries our name into the next generation. He has a wife to support and a baby on the way. He needs that money to provide for his family and build his future. You have been hoarding the operational budget for years. It is time for you to step aside and do what is right for this family. You do not need that massive salary, Camille. You just do not. I looked at my mother, truly looking at the woman who had raised me. I saw the absolute conviction in her eyes. She genuinely believed that my labor belonged to my brother. She believed that because I had chosen to build a career instead of marrying the first man who asked, I was somehow fundamentally undeserving of the financial rewards of my own hard work. In her mind, I was merely a supporting character in the grand cinematic production of Jamal's life. So, let me get this straight, I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. You authorized Chloe to humiliate me in a conference room. You fabricated a lie about me stealing company time to terminate my contract without cause. You did all of this to steal my office, my title, and my salary so you could hand it to a man who works 15 hours a week just because he managed to get his wife pregnant. Jamal finally found his voice, though he still lacked the courage to look me directly in the eye. He stared at his plate as he spoke. Come on, Camille, he muttered. Do not make this a whole thing. You know I have been waiting for my shot to lead. I am the vice president now. You have had your run. It is my turn to take the wheel. Mom and Dad are just doing what is best for the future of the company. I stared at my younger brother. I remembered the countless times I had covered for his massive logistical errors. I remembered the time I stayed awake for 3 straight days to untangle a customs nightmare he caused because he forgot to file international import documents. He was a boy playing dress-up in a corporate world he did not understand, and my parents were handing him the matches to burn it all down. You are giving the wheel to a man who does not even know how to start the engine, I said coldly, turning my attention back to Jerome. You think the buyers care about optics? The buyers care about profit margins, Jerome. They care about supply chain efficiency. They care about predictive freight algorithms. Things Jamal cannot even spell, let alone manage. Jerome slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the expensive silverware enough. He barked. his face flushing with anger. "I will not have you stand in my dining room and disrespect your brother. This is my company. I make the decisions. We gave you a job when you graduated. We gave you a platform to succeed. Now it is time for you to do your duty to this family and support your brother's transition." Jerome took a deep breath, attempting to rein his temper and project the image of a reasonable patriarch. "We are not throwing you out on the street, Camille. We are willing to be generous, but that generosity comes with expectations. We called you here tonight to finalize the transition paperwork." He gestured to a thick manila folder resting on the table near his champagne glass. "We have an agreement for you to sign. If you cooperate and do this quietly, we will make sure you are taken care of. If you choose to be difficult, you will walk away with absolutely nothing." Vivian reached out with her heavily ringed fingers and pulled the thick manila folder from beside Jerome's champagne glass. She slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of me. The pristine white paper contrasted sharply with the dark wood. I looked down at the bold legal font at the very top of the first page. It was a formal transfer of equity and shareholder rights. 5 years ago, when this company was on the absolute brink of Chapter 11 bankruptcy due to Jerome's reckless commercial real estate investments, I had demanded a 15% minority shareholder stake. It was my condition for working 90-hour weeks to restructure their massive debt and save them from total liquidation. I had earned every fraction of that percentage by keeping the wolves from their door. Now they wanted it back for zero. "It is a simple relinquishment of shares," Vivian said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She folded her hands neatly on the table, looking at me as if she were asking me to pass the salt rather than sign away my legal ownership. "We think it would be a beautiful gesture, Camille. You transferring your 15% stake to Jamal as a wedding gift. It keeps the voting power consolidated. It gives him the equity he needs to sit at the head of the boardroom table with absolute authority. A wedding gift." I stared at my mother, letting the sheer insanity of her request wash over me. She wanted me to hand over my life savings, my sweat equity, and my only leverage in the company to a brother who had never successfully balanced his own personal checking account. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, taking her cue to join the ambush. Her eyes gleamed with the toxic, unearned authority of a woman who had married into power and was desperate to flex it. "We have already drafted your severance package, Camille," she said, adopting a fake tone of corporate sympathy. "It is quite generous considering you were terminated for cause. However, as the new Director of Human Resources, I have placed an administrative freeze on your payout." I raised an eyebrow, giving her the silent invitation to continue digging her own grave. "Company policy allows us to withhold severance payouts pending the resolution of internal audits and equity transfers." Chloe explained her smile, turning into a self-satisfied smirk. "We simply cannot process your exit package or release your health insurance continuation forms until this shareholder transfer is completely finalized. Once you sign the paper in front of you giving Jamal his shares, I will personally see to it that your severance check is expedited. We want this to be a clean break for everyone." It was extortion, pure textbook financial extortion. They honestly believed they had me trapped. In their minds, I was a 5-year-old single woman who had just lost her sole source of income. They thought I was desperate. They assumed I had a mortgage to pay, car notes to manage, and no safety net to fall back on. They calculated that the immediate threat of losing my severance pay and my health care would force me to surrender my 15% equity just to survive the month. They had absolutely no idea that my 15% stake in their dying company was couch change compared to my ownership of Omni Logistics. They had no idea I could buy their entire estate with a single wire transfer and not even notice a dent in my portfolio. Jamal tapped his fingers impatiently against his crystal champagne flute. "Just sign the paper, Camille," he muttered, looking annoyed that I was taking too long to surrender. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. Mom and Dad are giving you a graceful way out. Take the severance money and go figure out your next move. I have a major acquisition meeting to prepare for, and I need this equity transfer logged into the company ledger by tomorrow morning." I looked down at the expensive company pen resting on top of the legal contract. Then I looked at the 4 faces staring back at me. My father, who viewed me only as a stepping stone for his son. My mother, who saw my lack of a husband as a valid reason to strip me of my wealth. My brother, who felt entirely entitled to the fruits of my labor, and my sister-in-law, who was giddy with the thrill of wielding stolen power. For my entire adult life, I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn their respect. I had sacrificed holidays, relationships, and my own peace of mind to keep this family afloat. I had operated under the delusion that if I just worked hard enough, if I just saved them from enough disasters, they would eventually see my value. Sitting in that dining room, listening to them extort me for a wedding gift, I felt that final fragile thread of familial obligation snap. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and pushed myself up slowly. I stood to my full height, towering over their seated celebration. The sudden movement caused Jamal to flinch and pull his chair back slightly. Chloe dropped her smirk instantly, her eyes darting to Jerome for protection. Camille Jerome barked, his voice laced with warning. "Sit down and sign the document. We are not playing games with you." "I am not playing games either, Jerome," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register that silenced the room completely. "I am leaving," Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her pearl necklace. "You cannot leave," she cried out, her voice shrill with sudden panic. "If you walk out that door without signing those papers, you will get nothing. Chloe will cancel your severance. We will cut you off completely, Camille. You will be entirely on your own." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a cold titanium boundary locking firmly into place. "I have been entirely on my own for 10 years, Vivian," I replied. "I just finally stopped paying for the privilege." I turned my attention to my younger brother. Jamal was staring at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant facade slipping as he realized I was actually refusing the order. He was about to inherit a logistical empire that he did not know how to run, and he was banking on my fear to keep the transition smooth. "I hope you know how to route the commercial freight lines, Jamal," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on his. "I hope you know how to calm down the union representatives at the Savannah port when the payroll checks bounce. I hope you memorize the predictive weather algorithms for the Midwest shipping routes, because a blizzard is hitting Ohio on Thursday, and 30 of our trucks are currently scheduled to drive right into it." Jamal swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. The color began to drain from his face as the reality of his new vice president title crashed down on him. "Because when those trucks stall," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the dining room, "when the vendors start calling to demand their overdue payments, and when the entire supply chain fractures into a million pieces, I will not be here to save you, and I certainly will not be answering the phone when it breaks." I turned away from the table. I did not look back as I walked across the dining room, leaving the manila folder and the unsigned contract resting next to their flat champagne. Camille Jerome roared, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor as he stood up to chase me. "You get back here right now. If you walk out of this house, you are dead to this family. You hear me? You are finished." I ignored his shouting, letting it wash over my back like useless noise. I walked through the grand marble foyer, my heels clicking, a steady rhythmic tempo against the stone. The heavy wooden front door stood between me and the cool Atlanta night air. I reached out, grabbed the brass handle, and pulled the door open. Behind me, I could hear Vivian crying out dramatically, pretending to be the victim of an ungrateful daughter. I could hear Chloe desperately asking Jerome what they were going to do about the equity transfer. I stepped out onto the sprawling stone porch and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The solid final thud of the door locking into place cut off their shouting instantly. I walked down the steps toward my car, breathing in the crisp night air. I did not have my job. I did not have my family. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They had no idea that they had just given me the ultimate freedom to burn their empire to the ground. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the estate without looking in the rearview mirror. The 7-5-hour countdown was still ticking, and I had a second job to prepare for. The next 48 hours were an absolute masterclass in corporate self-destruction. I did not have to be inside the family warehouse to know exactly how the chaos was unfolding. I had built the entire operational infrastructure from scratch over the last decade, and I knew exactly how long it would take for the machine to seize up without my daily calibration. I woke up on Wednesday morning in my downtown apartment, poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, and opened my personal tablet. I logged into the private server dashboard that hosted my proprietary logistics software. I had coded those predictive freight algorithms myself using my own resources during my limited off hours 5 years ago. I held the sole legal copyright to the software architecture under my own independent limited liability company. For years, I had allowed my parents' firm to utilize my software license for free as a courtesy. But the moment Chloe forced me to sign my termination papers and demanded my company laptop, I legally revoked their access keys. At exactly 6 inches the morning, the automated dispatch system failed to ping the Southeast trucking fleet. I watched the live data stream on my tablet drop to 0. The daily delivery manifests, which normally auto-populated for the warehouse managers across 3 states, printed out as completely blank pages. By 8:30 inches the morning, the reality of their situation would have hit Jamal directly in his smug face. The refrigerated trucks carrying highly perishable agricultural goods out of Florida were suddenly flying blind with no temperature-monitored routing guides. The commercial auto parts scheduled for a massive manufacturing plant assembly line in Detroit were sitting idle on loading docks in Georgia. Jamal would have strutted into my former corner office, sat behind my desk, and tried to log into the main operations terminal to project his new vice president authority, and he would have hit a massive, impenetrable digital wall. He did not know the manual override codes. He did not know the personal cell phone numbers of the union representatives who controlled the dock workers in Savannah. He had no concept of how to manually calculate weight distributions for commercial weigh stations. Without my software, the family business was reduced to a fleet of expensive trucks with absolutely nowhere to go. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping my coffee, and watching the red alert notifications slowly begin to populate on my secondary monitor. The freight was stalling. The supply chain was fracturing exactly as I had warned them it would. By noon, my personal phone began to ring. It was not my family. It was the client roster. The mid-level logistics coordinators at our partnered manufacturing firms were calling me directly, bypassing the family company's official support lines because no one at the warehouse was answering their questions. I let every single call go to voicemail. I was no longer their employee, and I was certainly not about to do uncompensated crisis management for a brother who had tried to extort my life savings. Jamal was drowning. He had demanded the wheel of the ship, but the moment he realized it was sinking, he panicked. Any competent executive in his position would have immediately picked up the phone, called me, and desperately tried to negotiate a licensing fee for the software, or begged me to return as a high-paid consultant to fix the immediate crisis. But Jamal was not a competent executive. He was a spoiled child masquerading in a tailored suit, and instead of swallowing his pride, he ran directly to his wife. Chloe, with her entirely unearned authority and total lack of corporate experience, decided that the best way to handle a catastrophic operational failure was to launch a scorched earth offensive against me. She calculated that if she could destroy my professional reputation, no one would question why the company was suddenly failing. She wanted to control the narrative before the clients realized Jamal was completely incompetent. At 4 inches the afternoon, my tablet chimed with an incoming email. It was not sent to me directly. It was forwarded to my private inbox by a trusted industry contact, a senior supply chain manager at a major retail distributor who had worked closely with me for 8 years. She had attached a single message with a note that read, "Camille, you need to see this right now. Call your lawyers." I opened the forwarded email. It had been dispatched from the official Human Resources Director account of my family firm, signed with Chloe's full name and her brand new title. She had not just sent it to a few internal managers. Chloe had authorized a mass blast email to our entire active client roster, our national vendor network, and our union representatives. I read the text of the email carefully, my eyes tracking over every single defamatory word. To our valued partners and clients, Chloe had written, "We are currently experiencing temporary service interruptions across our routing network. Please be advised that these delays are directly related to the abrupt termination of our former senior operations director." This individual was dismissed from our company following the discovery of unauthorized outside employment and is currently the subject of an ongoing internal investigation regarding gross financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest ethical standards in our industry, and we will not hesitate to sever ties with any individual who compromises the integrity of our family business. We are working diligently to restore full operational capacity under our new Vice President of Operations. I stared at the screen, letting the sheer monumental stupidity of her actions wash over me. Chloe had just accused me in writing to hundreds of my professional peers of gross financial misconduct. She had broadcast a blatant, malicious lie across state lines to the very people who controlled the logistics industry in the Southeast. She was actively attempting to blacklist me to ensure that I would never secure another executive position in the corporate world again. She wanted to humiliate me, to paint me as a thief and a fraud, so that Jamal would look like a stabilizing hero rather than the architect of their current disaster. She thought she was being clever. She thought she was using powerful corporate buzzwords to intimidate the clients into staying patient, while Jamal tried to figure out how to start the trucks. Instead, Chloe had just handed me the legal equivalent of a loaded bazooka. In her desperate attempt to cover up my brother's ineptitude, she had committed highly actionable, documented corporate leal. She had used official company communication channels to defame a former executive without a single shred of financial proof or legal backing. She had exposed my parents' firm to a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit on her second day of work. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I did not feel the urge to cry or scream at the injustice of my own family trying to destroy my reputation. I felt a cold, sharp surge of pure adrenaline. I took a screenshot of the email, downloaded the original file headers, and forwarded the entire package directly to the lead litigator at my private corporate law firm. I added a brief note: "Preserve this for discovery. Do not issue a cease and desist yet. Let them keep digging." They wanted to play corporate warfare, but they had brought a butter knife to a nuclear launch site. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the massive shadow looming right over their heads. The clients were panicking. The freight was rotting on the docks, and my family was too busy drafting smear campaigns to realize that the 7-5-hour countdown was ticking closer to zero. I set my tablet down on the kitchen island and smiled, walking over to my closet to select the perfect suit for my next engagement. My phone began to vibrate violently against the smooth quartz of my kitchen island. It was not a steady, intermittent buzz, but a relentless, continuous assault. I stood in my walk-in closet, running my hand over the sleeve of a charcoal gray tailored suit, ignoring the frantic digital demands echoing from the other room. They were realizing the magnitude of their mistake, and the sheer panic was setting in exactly on schedule. I took my time selecting a crisp white silk blouse to pair with the suit. I matched it with a pair of understated but undeniably expensive heels. Only when my armor was fully assembled did I walk back into the kitchen and pick up the device. The screen was a wall of bright red notifications, 27 missed calls, 14 unread text messages, and 5 new voicemails, all from my mother. I tapped the screen and pressed play on the first audio message. Vivian's voice flooded my quiet apartment. The pristine, carefully modulated tone she used for country club lunch-ons was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, brittle sound of barely contained hysteria. Camille picked up the phone. Vivian snapped her breath, hitching slightly. "I know you are sitting there ignoring me. What you are doing to this family right now is beyond vindictive. You locked us out of the routing software. You are deliberately trying to embarrass your brother on his very first day as vice president. Unlock the system right now and stop throwing a temper tantrum just because you were held accountable for your secret little side projects." I deleted the message and let the second one play. 30 minutes had passed between the first and second calls, and Vivian's tactic had shifted from demanding authority to venomous psychological warfare. "You are acting like a bitter, jealous spinster, Camille." My mother hissed through the speaker, the vitriol practically dripping from the audio file. "You cannot stand to see your brother happy, can you? You have always resented him because he found a beautiful wife, because he is starting a family, because he has a real future. You sit alone in that downtown apartment hoarding your money and your operations codes, while your brother is trying to build a legacy. You are 35 years old. It is not our fault you do not have a husband or children to focus your energy on. Do not you dare take your personal failures out on Jamal." I stood completely still in my kitchen, listening to the woman who gave birth to me weaponize my entire existence. She was attempting to gaslight me into believing that my professional boundaries were actually symptoms of deep-seated romantic jealousy. She needed to frame me as a miserable, lonely woman lashing out at her golden brother, because if she admitted the truth that I was a highly competent executive protecting my legal intellectual property, she would have to admit that her son was an incompetent fraud. The third, fourth, and fifth voicemails were variations of the same toxic theme. Vivian threatened to disown me. She threatened to call the police and report me for corporate sabotage, entirely ignorant of the fact that the software legally belonged to me. She called me ungrateful, selfish, and cold. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of daughterly guilt that used to paralyze me in my 20s. I felt only a profound clinical detachment. Vivian was not speaking to me as a mother speaks to a child. She was a warden screaming at a draft horse that had finally snapped its harness and walked out of the field. Then the phone screen lit up again. An incoming call from Uncle Roland. Roland was the chief financial officer of the family firm. He was my father's younger brother and the ultimate corporate enabler. He was the man who quietly shifted budget lines to cover up Jamal's massive logistical blunders. He was the man who always looked the other way when Jerome used company funds for personal real estate investments. Unlike Vivian and Chloe, Roland actually understood the math. He knew exactly what the numbers looked like when the freight stopped moving. I swiped the green button and answered the call. "Uncle Roland," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and unbothered. "Camille. Thank God you picked up." Roland exhaled, his voice trembling with genuine sweat-inducing panic. He sounded like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, watching the lifeboats sail away. "Please tell me you are near a computer. You have to help us. We have a massive situation here." I leaned against the kitchen counter, inspecting my manicure. "By we, I assume you mean the company I no longer work for," I replied. Roland let out a frantic, breathless noise. "Do not do this right now, Camille. Please." Jamal tried to manually reroute the Miami shipping lanes this morning because the automated system went down. He did not realize the Port Authority requires the specific vendor override codes you set up last year. He accidentally canceled the primary distribution contract with our biggest client in Florida. $3 million worth of agricultural inventory is currently sitting on the loading docks rotting in the sun, and the port managers are threatening to impound our entire southern fleet by noon. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer magnitude of Jamal's incompetence. He had managed to cause a $3 million breach of contract in less than 4 hours of holding the vice president title. It was almost impressive how quickly he had set the building on fire. "That sounds like a severe operational crisis, Roland," I noted, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "The vice president of operations should probably handle that immediately. I hear he needs the corner office to properly project authority during situations exactly like this one." "Camille, stop it," Roland begged, his voice cracking. "You know, he does not know how to fix this. The clients are screaming at us. Jerome is in meetings trying to secure a bridge loan just to keep the lights on, and Chloe sent out some insane mass email that has half the vendors threatening to pull their accounts. We are bleeding money by the second. Then I suggest you hire a competent supply chain crisis manager," I said. "I am sure you can find someone willing to step in for the right price. That is the problem." Camille Roland admitted the shame finally bleeding into his panicked voice. "We do not have the budget to hire an outside firm right now. The severance freeze Chloe put on your account. We actually needed that liquid capital to cover the payroll shortfall this week. We are completely tapped out." The audacity was staggering. They had fired me, stolen my salary to give to Jamal, frozen my severance pay to cover their own bankruptcy, and now the chief financial officer was calling to ask me to save them. "I need you to just log in remotely," Roland pleaded, adopting the soft, placating tone he always used when trying to manipulate me into fixing the family's messes. "Just log into your software as an unpaid consultant, Camille. Just for a few days until we get the Miami fleet moving and stabilize the accounts. We can figure out the official paperwork later." "An unpaid consultant." I repeated the words slowly, letting the sheer disrespect of the request echo between us. "You want the woman you fired yesterday to work for free today to save the career of the man who took her job. We are family," Camille Roland pleaded, playing the ultimate toxic trump card. He lowered his voice, adopting a conspiratorial whisper. "You know how your brother is. You know Jamal is not built for stress. He is currently having a severe panic attack locked inside your old office. He is terrified of Jerome finding out what he did in Miami. Please do this for me. Do this for your family. Do this." I stood up straight, my spine locking into absolute perfect alignment. The final shred of empathy I held for any of these people vanished into thin air. "If Jamal is not built for stress, Uncle Roland," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, razor-sharp register, "then Jerome should not have built him a throne. But Camille, I am begging you." Roland started the panic turning into raw desperation. "My consulting rate is $5,000 an hour with a minimum retainer of $100,000 paid entirely upfront in certified funds," I stated calmly. "Since you just admitted you cannot even make payroll, I suggest you tell Jamal to start learning how to drive a truck. He is going to need a new career very soon." I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring Roland's frantic shouting, and pressed the red button to end the call. I immediately opened his contact profile and selected block caller. I did the exact same thing for Vivian, Jerome, Jamal, and Chloe. I set the phone down on the counter. The silence that followed was absolute and beautiful. They were entirely sealed off, locked inside the burning building of their own making. I adjusted the collar of my crisp white silk blouse, picked up my leather briefcase, and headed for the door. I had a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition meeting to prepare for, and I was not going to be late. The heavy oak door of my apartment clicked shut, locking away the digital chaos of my family. I walked down the carpeted hallway to the private parking garage, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. When I slid into the driver's seat of my car, the interior was blissfully silent. I placed my leather briefcase on the passenger seat right next to my completely blocked phone. For the first time in 10 years, my morning commute was not interrupted by a frantic call from a dispatcher or an angry vendor demanding payment. I started the engine and merged onto the bustling Atlanta streets. The morning sun was bright, reflecting off the glass facades of the city buildings. I had a very specific route planned for today. It was a slight detour from my usual commute to the financial district, but I considered it a necessary viewing. I needed to see the physical manifestation of my absence. I steered my car toward the industrial sector on the outskirts of the city, where the family logistics warehouse had stood for over 3 decades. As I approached the sprawling complex, the signs of catastrophic failure were immediately visible from blocks away. A massive line of commercial 1-8 wheelers had completely gridlocked the 2-lane access road. The trucks were backed up past the main intersection, creating a deafening chorus of blaring air horns and shouting drivers. I slowed my car down, slightly, gliding past the chaos to observe the full scope of Jamal's absolute incompetence. The heavy steel gates to the loading docks were jammed wide open. I could see the forklift operators standing around on the concrete bays, with their hands on their hips, looking entirely lost. The yard managers were aggressively waving clipboards at a group of frustrated long-haul drivers who had clearly been waiting hours for their route manifests. The digital display board above the main shipping bay, which was supposed to show the automated loading schedule, was completely blank. It was a logistical cardiac arrest playing out in real time. I looked up at the second-floor windows of the main administrative building. I knew exactly which window belonged to my former corner office. The blinds were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the morning sun. I pictured Jamal sitting behind my old mahogany desk, sweating through his expensive custom suit, staring at a frozen computer monitor while the entire company burned to the ground around him. He had wanted the crown in the corner office so desperately. Now he was locked inside it, listening to the angry shouts of unpaid drivers echoing through the glass. I did not feel a single shred of pity for him or for my parents who put him there. They had treated my 10 years of grueling, meticulous labor as if it were a basic automated function they were simply entitled to own. Now they were learning the actual staggering cost of my absence. I pressed the accelerator and drove away from the industrial park, leaving the gridlocked trucks and the failing family business in my rearview mirror. With every mile I put between myself and that dusty, chaotic warehouse, the air seemed to grow clearer. The landscape of the city began to shift drastically. The crumbling pavement and chain-link fences of the industrial zone gave way to the pristine, manicured boulevards of downtown Atlanta. I glanced at my reflection in the rear-view mirror, adjusting the collar of my crisp white silk blouse one more time. The tailored charcoal gray suit I wore was an immaculate piece of armor. It was an outfit Vivian and Jerome had never seen me wear. They only knew the exhausted, stressed version of their daughter, who wore practical business, casual clothes that could withstand long 1-2-hour shifts on a dirty loading dock. They only knew the woman they could bully and manipulate and extort. They had absolutely no concept of the woman currently driving toward the financial district. I turned my car onto a wide, pristine avenue lined with towering modern skyscrapers. These architectural marvels of glass and steel represented the true power center of the city. This was a world my parents desperately wanted to belong to, but could never quite reach because they were too busy funding my brother's countless failures. I approached the tallest and most imposing corporate high-rise on the entire block. The building was a sheer, vertical monolith of reflective blue glass mirroring the endless morning sky. I bypassed the main visitor parking entrance entirely. Instead, I steered my car toward a discreet ramp at the side of the building that led down into a highly secured underground parking facility. The heavy metal security gate recognized the encrypted transponder in my vehicle and rolled open smoothly without me having to tap the brakes. I drove down into the brightly lit, pristine garage, steering past rows of luxury vehicles until I reached a private section cordoned off from the rest of the floor. I pulled my car into a wide, oversized spot marked with a polished metal plaque that simply read Chief Executive Officer. I turned off the engine, picked up my leather briefcase, and stepped out into the cool, quiet air of the garage. The sharp click of my heels echoed rhythmically against the polished concrete as I walked toward the private entrance doors. I swiped my highly encrypted access card and entered the lower level of the corporate lobby. The contrast between the environment I had just left and the one I was stepping into was absolute. The main lobby of this corporate high-rise was a masterpiece of modern architectural design featuring imported Italian marble floors, soaring vated ceilings, and minimalist water features that created a low, calming hum. Hundreds of professionals in sharp, expensive suits buzzed around the main reception area, lining up at the security desks to sign in and present their corporate credentials. I did not walk towards the reception desk. I did not wait in any lines or speak to any guest coordinators. I walked right past the crowds of visiting executives and mid-level managers, my posture perfectly straight and my gaze fixed firmly forward. A pair of uniformed security guards standing near the main thoroughfare recognized me instantly. They stepped aside immediately, offering polite, highly respectful nods as I glided past them. I headed directly toward a secluded alcove, hidden behind a sleek architectural stone partition. Located inside this quiet, heavily guarded alcove was a single elevator reserved exclusively for the top-floor executives. There were no buttons to press to call the car. Next to the brushed steel doors was a small biometric security panel. I stepped up to the panel and placed my thumb against the cool glass sensor. The machine let out a soft confirming chime-in, and the small indicator light flashed a brilliant, vibrant green. The heavy steel doors glided open silently, revealing a spacious, pristine elevator car lined with dark, polished wood and soft, recessed lighting. I stepped inside and turned around to face the lobby just as the doors began to close again. Through the narrowing gap, I watched the chaotic, busy world of the standard corporate hierarchy completely fade away. I was physically and symbolically elevating myself far above the fray of normal business operations. The elevator began its rapid, smooth ascent, shooting up through the core of the skyscraper, carrying me directly toward the pinnacle of my own hidden empire. The 5-hour countdown was nearing its end, and my second job was about to officially begin. The soft chime of the elevator signaled my arrival. The brushed steel doors parted smoothly, revealing the sprawling expanse of the penthouse suite. The transition was absolute. This was not a chaotic loading dock, smelling of diesel fumes and panic. This was the pinnacle of corporate power, bathed in natural light streaming through Florida ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. Behind a sleek marble reception desk, my lead executive assistant, Kesha, immediately stood up. Her posture was flawless, her expression carrying the sharp, efficient professionalism I demanded from everyone in this building. "Good morning, Madam CEO," Kesha said, her voice clear and respectful. "Your acquisitions team is already assembled in the main boardroom. They are waiting for your final review before the afternoon meeting." "Thank you, Kesha," I replied, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer. "Please hold all external calls for the next hour. The only interruptions I will accept are updates from the legal department regarding our new asset transfers." I walked past the reception area and down the wide glass-lined corridor. Every office I passed was filled with brilliant, fiercely loyal executives and highly competent analysts. There were no golf clubs leaning against desks. There were no relatives holding fabricated titles to mask their incompetence. I had handpicked every single person on this floor based purely on their intelligence and their drive. It was the exact opposite of the nepotism-riddled warehouse I had just left behind. 5 years ago, I saw the writing on the wall. My father had nearly bankrupted our family logistics firm on a catastrophic commercial real estate gamble. He blamed the economy. I knew it was his ego. I stepped in, worked grueling 9 zero-hour weeks, and pulled them back from the brink of total liquidation. I demanded my 15% minority equity stake as compensation for saving them. But I was not naive. I knew that tying my financial future to a ship captained by Jerome and destined to be inherited by Jamal was professional suicide. I needed a safety net. I needed an exit strategy because I knew the day would eventually come when they would try to throw me overboard. So, I built a lifeboat. And over the course of 5 years, through meticulous planning, strategic investments, and relentless dedication, That lifeboat grew into a heavily armed battleship, using a blind trust and a complex network of limited liability companies to completely mask my identity. I founded Omni Logistics. I leveraged the deep industry relationships I had cultivated, relationships with manufacturing executives and union leaders who trusted my word implicitly over my father's. I poured every bonus, every consulting fee, and every spare dollar I had into building an infrastructure that was vastly superior to the aging dinosaur my parents were running. While my family thought I was just their overworked operations director who had no personal life, I was secretly acting as the silent billionaire CEO of one of the fastest-growing holding companies in the southeastern United States. My so-called second job was owning the very industry my family was currently failing at. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was almost intoxicating. For the past 6 months, Jerome and Uncle Roland had been aggressively courting Omni Logistics. They were drowning in commercial debt, largely due to Jamal embezzling company funds to finance Chloe's newly acquired taste for luxury cars and country club memberships. Their only salvation, their absolute last hope of avoiding federal bankruptcy, was securing a total corporate buyout from my company. They had submitted their heavily doctored financial portfolios to my acquisitions team, begging the faceless corporate giant to swoop in and buy them out for a massive premium. They thought Omni Logistics was run by a board of distant, wealthy investors. They had absolutely no idea that the titan they were begging for a lifeline was the very daughter they had just fired to clear a path for their golden boy. I pushed open the heavy glass door to my private office. My chief operating officer, Harrison, was already sitting at the long conference table situated at the far end of the suite. Harrison was a ruthless, brilliant tactician who knew exactly who my family was and exactly what they had done to me over the last decade. "Good morning," Camille Harrison said, sliding a thick black leather portfolio across the table. "I have the finalized audit reports from your parents' firm. It is worse than we originally projected. Jamal's manual override in Miami this morning just triggered a chain reaction of contract breaches across the entire southern seaboard. They are hemorrhaging capital by the minute." I took my seat at the head of the table, placing my briefcase down and opening the portfolio. I scanned the updated financial models, noting the massive deficits bleeding across the spreadsheets. "Uncle Roland just called me an hour ago." I noted, keeping my tone strictly business. "He tried to beg me to log in as an unpaid consultant to fix the Miami disaster. They cannot even make payroll this week. They froze my severance package to cover their operational shortfall." Harrison let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "They froze the severance of the woman who is secretly about to buy their entire company. The level of financial illiteracy is staggering even for them." "It gets better," I said. Pulling the termination paperwork had forced me to sign out of my briefcase. I slid the documents over the smooth table toward Harrison. "Chloe fired me, effective immediately for unauthorized moonlighting. In her desperate rush to clear the corner office for Jamal, she completely bypassed standard corporate termination protocols. She voided my non-compete clause." Harrison picked up the paperwork, reading through Chloe's amateur legal phrasing. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face as he realized the magnitude of her mistake. "She practically handed you the keys to their kingdom," Harrison said, tapping the document. "Since your non-compete is officially null and void, Omni Logistics has spent the last 48 hours legally absorbing their client roster. We have already secured 90% of their primary vendors under our own corporate umbrella. When they walk into the buyout meeting today, they will literally have nothing left to sell us." I leaned back in my leather executive chair, looking out over the sprawling city below. The 7 5-hour countdown was mere hours away from hitting zero. Jerome, Vivian, Jamal, and Chloe were currently sitting in their dying warehouse, desperately preparing the boardroom for the Omni Logistics acquisition team. They were probably laying out expensive catered food, rehearsing their fraudulent financial pitches, and dreaming of the massive payout that would validate all of their toxic, arrogant choices. They had spent my entire life treating me like a workhorse, a disposable asset they could use and discard at their convenience. They told me I did not need my salary because I was a single woman without a legacy. They tried to extort my life savings to fund a wedding gift for a brother who could not even route a single freight truck without causing a regional disaster. They fired me because they thought I was stealing company time. They were about to find out that I was the one who owned the clock. I was going to walk into their boardroom, look them dead in the eye, and legally dismantle their entire empire stroke by stroke. I picked up the black leather portfolio, snapping it shut with a definitive, satisfying click. Prepare the legal team, Harris and I ordered, standing up from the table. It is time to go buy a logistics company. The convoy of sleek black Cadillac SUVs rolled onto the cracked, uneven asphalt of the industrial park precisely at 1:45 inches the afternoon. The transition from the pristine financial district to this decaying logistics yard was jarring. I sat in the back of the lead vehicle, watching the familiar chain-link fences glide past my tinted window. The yard was a ghost town. Just 48 hours ago, this space had been gridlocked with angry drivers and stalled freight. Now it was entirely desolate. The drivers had all gone home. The trucks were parked in crooked, haphazard lines. The warehouse doors were rolled down and locked shut. My software blackout and Chloe's subsequent smear campaign had effectively euthanized the company. There was no freight left to move. I stepped out of the vehicle into the heavy, humid Georgia heat. Harrison stepped out beside me, flanked by three of the most ruthless corporate acquisition attorneys in the southeastern United States. They wore razor-sharp bespoke suits carrying thick leather briefcases filled with the legal instruments of my family's destruction. We did not speak. We did not need to. The strategy was locked in place. We walked in perfect unison toward the main administrative building, our footsteps crunching in sync against the gravel. The ground floor reception area was completely abandoned. The front desk associate had clearly walked off the job, likely realizing that her next paycheck was going to bounce. The silence in the building was heavy and suffocating. It smelled of stale coffee, cardboard, and impending doom. We bypassed the empty reception desk and headed straight for the main stairwell. I knew every inch of this building. I knew exactly which floorboard creaked on the second landing. I knew exactly how long it took the air conditioning unit to kick on. I had practically lived in this building for a decade. Now I was walking through it as an undertaker. When we reached the executive floor, I held up my hand, signaling for Harrison and the legal team to stop. We stood in the dimly lit carpeted hallway just out of sight of the main glass-walled boardroom. Through the thick soundproof glass, I had a completely unobstructed view of the stage they had set. The 7-5-hour countdown was mere minutes away from hitting zero, and the panic inside that room was absolutely palpable. Jerome was pacing relentlessly back and forth at the head of the long conference table. He kept checking his heavy gold Rolex watch, a watch he had purchased with company funds during a quarter when we could barely afford to pay our warehouse staff. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy shade of red, and a visible sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He was desperately trying to project the image of a powerful, confident patriarch, but his shoulders were hunched under the crushing weight of his commercial debt. He believed that today was the day he would sell his failing empire to a faceless corporate titan and walk away millions of dollars richer. He believed his legacy was about to be saved. Vivian was fluttering nervously around a massive silver catering display set up on the credenza. Even on the absolute brink of total financial collapse, my mother could only focus on optics. She had ordered an extravagant spread of artisanal sandwiches, imported cheeses, and sparkling water. She was meticulously rearranging the crystal pictures, trying to make a bankrupt company look like a thriving, lucrative enterprise. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the catering company had likely charged the order to a corporate credit card that was going to decline by midnight. She wanted to charm the Omni Logistics executives with Southern hospitality, hoping they would not look too closely at the structural rot hiding behind her polite smile. Sitting directly across from the catering display was Uncle Roland. The chief financial officer looked physically ill. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing large, dark sweat stains circling his underarms. In front of him sat 3 thick, glossy binders. I knew exactly what was inside those binders. They were the fraudulent financial reports he had spent the last 6 months doctoring. Roland had buried Jamal's staggering financial crimes deep within the ledgers, shifting liabilities and inflating projected revenues to make the company look solvent. He was clutching a pen so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was terrified. He knew that if the Omni Logistics auditors actually scrutinized the raw data, he would be facing federal prison time for corporate fraud. He was praying for a blind, ignorant buyer. And then there was the golden couple. Jamal and Chloe sat together on the far side of the massive table. The arrogant, confident posture they had displayed in the human resources room just 3 days ago had completely evaporated. Jamal was shaking his legs so violently the heavy mahogany table was actually vibrating. He looked exhausted. The bags under his eyes were dark and prominent. He had spent the last 2 days locked inside my former office, trying to decipher a supply chain crisis he had absolutely no capacity to understand. He had canceled contracts, lost millions in inventory, and single-handedly driven the final nail into the coffin of our family legacy. The reality of his own incompetence was finally suffocating him. He kept wiping his sweaty palms on his expensive custom trousers, terrified that his father would uncover the truth about the missing funds. Jamal had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the operational budget to buy Chloe a brand new luxury SUV, to fund their lavish honeymoon, and to secure a membership at the most exclusive country club in Atlanta. He thought the buyout money would replenish the accounts before Jerome ever noticed the missing capital. Chloe sat next to him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The smug, self-satisfied smirk she wore when she handed me my termination papers was entirely gone. She was furiously typing on her smartphone, her face pale and drawn. She had quickly realized that being a corporate executive was not just about wielding unearned authority and sending nasty emails. Her malicious smear campaign against me had spectacularly backfired, resulting in a mass exodus of our primary clients. She was currently watching the empire she had married into crumble to dust around her. She had wanted to be the wealthy, powerful wife of an executive titan, but instead she was sitting in a dying warehouse, tied to a man who was about to be indicted for grand larceny. I stood in the shadows watching them sweat, watching them nervously check their watches and adjust their ties. They were waiting for their savior. They were waiting for the brilliant, wealthy CEO of Omni Logistics to walk through those heavy double doors and hand them a golden parachute. They thought their deception had worked. They thought they had successfully pushed me out of the picture, leaving the path clear for them to claim a massive unearned payday. They had no idea that their savior and their executioner were the exact same person. I turned to Harrison. He looked down at his own watch and gave me a sharp, confirming nod. The 7-5-hour mark had officially arrived. It was time to pull the curtain down on this pathetic theater production. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal gray suit, took a slow, deep, stabilizing breath, and stepped out of the shadows. I walked directly toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, my corporate legal team falling into perfect, synchronized step right behind me. I placed my hands flat against the heavy brass handles of the double glass doors and pushed them open. They swung inward with a heavy rush of displaced air, shattering the stifling tension inside the room. My 3 corporate attorneys walked in immediately behind me, fanning out with precise military coordination. Harrison closed the heavy doors behind us, sealing the room. The sharp click of the metal latch echoed through the silent boardroom like a gunshot. For a span of perhaps 5 seconds, absolute total paralysis gripped the room. Nobody breathed. Jerome had been caught mid-pace, his foot hovering slightly above the expensive commercial carpet. Vivian was frozen, holding a pair of silver tongs over a platter of imported cheeses. Uncle Roland just stared, his mouth hanging slightly open as a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Jamal and Chloe looked like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. They had built a perfect little stage to perform the illusion of a successful family business, and I had just walked right onto it without a script. Vivian was the first to break the suffocating silence. The color rushed back into her face, burning a furious red across her cheeks. She dropped the silver tongs onto the credenza with a loud clatter. "Camille, what on earth do you think you are doing?" She hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper. She glanced frantically toward the glass walls overlooking the hallway, terrified that the Omni Logistics executives were about to walk in and witness this family drama. "Get out of here right now. You are deliberately trying to ruin the most important meeting in the history of this company. Have you lost your mind?" Jerome finally found his voice, his patriarchal authority kicking in as a frantic defense mechanism. He marched toward me, pointing a thick, heavy finger at my chest. "I warned you about coming back here," he growled, his face contorting with rage. "You no longer work for this firm. You have absolutely no business interrupting a closed-door executive acquisition meeting. Turn around and walk out before I have you arrested for trespassing. This is not a game, Camille. Millions of dollars are on the line today." I did not even blink. I did not stop walking. I moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, my heels clicking against the polished hardwood border of the conference room. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting an aura of absolute dominance that immediately put them on the defensive. Jamal stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He puffed out his chest, trying to embody the vice president title he had stolen from me just 3 days ago. "Chloe, call security down here immediately." Jamal ordered, his voice cracking slightly with underlying panic. "Tell them we have a hostile trespasser in the executive suite. I want her physically removed from the premises before the buyers arrive. I am not going to let my jealous sister ruin my transition." Chloe grabbed her smartphone from the table, her manicured fingers trembling as she tried to unlock the screen. She looked at me with a mixture of raw hatred and genuine fear. "I warned you, Camille," Chloe said, her voice shaking as she dialed the internal extension. "I told you what would happen if you made this difficult. You are completely unhinged. I am calling the police right now." I ignored her entirely. I ignored all of them. I did not raise my voice to match their desperate shouting. I did not justify my presence or answer a single one of their demands. I simply kept walking, maintaining my steady pace until I reached the far end of the long mahogany table. Harrison and my 3 attorneys moved in silent synchronization, taking up positions against the back wall. They stood like sentinels in their bespoke tailored suits, holding their thick leather briefcases with calm, intimidating professionalism. They did not say a word, but their sheer presence radiated corporate lethality. It was an unspoken warning that they were not here to negotiate family grievances. They were here to execute a financial slaughter. I reached the head of the table. I stood directly behind the largest, most imposing leather chair in the room. It was the seat situated directly opposite of Jerome. It was the chair specifically reserved for the visiting chief executive officer of Omni Logistics. It was the seat of the savior they had been waiting for, the phantom billionaire who was supposed to bail them out of their massive commercial debt. I placed my hands on the high leather back of the chair, pulled it out smoothly, and sat down. I crossed my legs, comfortably smoothed the fabric of my charcoal gray suit, and rested my hands flat on the polished mahogany surface. I looked across the long expanse of the table, meeting Jerome's eyes with a stare so cold it could have frozen water. Jerome stared at me as if I had just committed an act of supreme sacrilege. "Get out of that chair, Camille." Jerome bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk collar. "That seat is reserved for the buyer. Are you actively trying to sabotage our legacy out of pure spite? Get up right now before they walk through those doors and see you making a mockery of this firm." Uncle Roland finally spoke up, his voice a dry, rasping wheeze. He clutched his fraudulent financial binders tightly to his chest. "Camille, please," he begged, wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. "You do not understand what is at stake here today. If you ruin this buyout, the entire family loses everything. We are begging you, just leave. I promise we will make it up to you later. We can talk about your severance tomorrow. Just please leave before the Omni Logistics team gets here." Chloe slammed her phone down on the table, letting out a frustrated noise. "The security desk is not answering," she snapped, glaring at Jamal. "Nobody is answering the front desk lines either." Of course, they were not answering. The front desk associate had walked out an hour ago, and the security guards had abandoned their posts when the operations floor devolved into total chaos. The building was completely empty, except for the people standing inside this boardroom. They were entirely isolated, and they did not even realize it yet. "Who are these people?" Jerome demanded, suddenly noticing the 3 lawyers standing silently behind me. He pointed a shaking finger at Harrison. "Who did you bring into my building, Camille? I demand to know who these men are." I looked at Uncle Roland, noting the deep terror etched into his aging features. I looked at Vivian, who was practically vibrating with rage, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. I looked at Jamal, who was glaring at me with the petulant fury of a child whose favorite toy had just been threatened. And finally, I looked at Chloe, whose smug arrogance had completely melted into a puddle of confused panic. I let the absolute silence stretch out for 10 full seconds, allowing the crushing weight of my presence to suffocate their remaining bravado. I watched them sweat. I watched them nervously check the hallway, waiting for a corporate savior who was never going to walk through those doors because she was already sitting right in front of them. I slowly reached down to the floor beside my chair where I had placed my imported leather briefcase. The room was so incredibly quiet that the sharp metallic click of the brass lock snapping open echoed against the glass walls like the cracking of a whip. Every single pair of eyes at the conference table tracked my movements. They watched me with a mixture of sheer outrage and profound confusion. They still believed I was just a bitter, terminated employee throwing a desperate temper tantrum to ruin their big day. They still believed they held the high ground. I reached inside the briefcase and wrapped my hands around the massive 300-page acquisition portfolio. It was incredibly heavy, containing every single financial audit, every asset evaluation, and every liability projection my corporate team had compiled over the last 6 months. It was bound in thick, premium black leather. Stamped directly in the center of the front cover in brilliant reflective silver foil was the sleek geometric logo of Omni Logistics. I lifted the heavy portfolio out of the briefcase and held it suspended above the polished mahogany surface for just a fraction of a second. I wanted them to see it. I wanted their eyes to focus on the silver lettering. Then I let it drop. The heavy leather binder hit the center of the table with a deafening, reverberating thud. The sheer force of the impact rattled the delicate crystal water pictures Vivian had so carefully arranged on the credenza. The sound snapped through the boardroom, cutting down the last remaining threads of my father's patriarchal authority. Jerome flinched backward, his eyes dropping instantly to the silver logo gleaming under the overhead lights. I watched his brain attempt to process the visual information. I watched the gears grind to a violent, agonizing halt. He recognized the logo immediately. He had spent the last half-year staring at that exact same corporate insignia on digital letterheads and non-disclosure agreements, praying to it like a religious idol. "Where did you get that?" Jerome demanded, his voice suddenly losing its booming resonance. He pointed a trembling finger at the black leather binder. The anger in his face was rapidly dissolving into a pale, sickly shade of raw confusion. "How do you have the internal acquisition documents for Omni Logistics, Camille? Did you steal those from my office?" He was still completely trapped in his own arrogant narrative. Even staring directly at the evidence, his ego simply could not compute the reality of the situation. He genuinely believed I had broken into his desk to steal the buyer's paperwork just to use it as a prop for a dramatic stunt. I did not answer his ridiculous question. I simply folded my hands, resting them lightly on top of the black leather binder. I looked at each of them, taking my time to make deliberate, chilling eye contact. I looked at Vivian, whose hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. I looked at Uncle Roland, who was staring at the silver logo with his mouth hanging slightly open, his breathing growing rapid and shallow. I looked at Jamal, who had retreated a full step away from the table, his posture shrinking as the protective bubble of his unearned vice president title burst into nothingness. And I looked at Chloe, whose wide, terrified eyes darted frantically between the portfolio and the 3 ruthless corporate attorneys standing silently behind me. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that had finally locked the cage door from the inside. "Hello, Jerome," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Hello, Jamal. Hello, Chloe. I am here representing Omni Logistics. And I am afraid I have some bad news about your buyout." The realization hit them like a runaway freight train. I could actually feel the oxygen violently evacuate the room. The absolute devastation of that single sentence struck each of them with the force of a physical blow. It was a cinematic masterpiece of structural collapse playing out in agonizing slow motion. Uncle Roland let out a choked, gasping noise and collapsed heavily into his chair. His hand flew to his chest, clutching the fabric of his dress shirt. As the chief financial officer, Roland was the only person in the room who truly understood the sheer staggering magnitude of wealth and corporate power required to build a holding company like Omni Logistics. He knew the buyer had hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid capital, and staring at me, sitting calmly at the head of the table, he finally realized that the niece he had manipulated and used for 10 years was the unseen billionaire pulling the strings of the entire industry. "No," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling so badly, the word barely materialized. "No, that is impossible. That is absolutely impossible. You do not work for them. You work for us. You are our operations director." "I do not work for them, Vivian." I corrected smoothly, my smile never wavering. "I own them. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Omni Logistics. I built the company 5 years ago, specifically to purchase failing, mismanaged logistics firms across the Southeast. Firms exactly like yours." Jerome grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and manic, refusing to accept his new reality. "You are lying," he shouted, spit flying from his lips. "You are a liar, Camille. This is a sick, vindictive trick. You do not have the capital to build a corporate empire. You do not have the authority. I know exactly how much money we paid you." Harrison, my chief operating officer, stepped forward from the back wall. He moved with the smooth, lethal grace of a corporate shark who smelled blood in the water. He reached into his own tailored jacket and produced a stack of embossed business cards, dropping them onto the table next to the portfolio. "My name is Harrison Sterling," he announced, his voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority. "I am the Chief Operating Officer of Omni Logistics. The three gentlemen standing beside me are our lead acquisition litigators, and the woman sitting in that chair is my boss. She holds total controlling interest in the holding company that you have been desperately begging for a financial bailout. You have spent the last 6 months submitting your corporate financials directly to her private servers." The color drained entirely from Jamal's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He looked at Chloe, seeking some kind of validation or protection, but his wife was completely paralyzed. Chloe was staring at me, her jaw trembling as the catastrophic weight of her own actions crushed the breath out of her lungs. Just 75 hours ago, Chloe had marched into a glass conference room and smugly fired the chief executive officer of the very company that was supposed to save her newfound lavish lifestyle. She had handed termination papers to a billionaire. She had sent a defamatory email accusing the wealthiest, most powerful woman in the regional supply chain industry of gross financial misconduct. She had actively tried to ruin the career of the only person standing between her husband and a federal fraud indictment. "You fired me for unauthorized moonlighting, Chloe," I said, leaning forward slightly and locking my eyes onto hers. "You demanded to know what my second job was. Well, here it is. You are currently looking at my side hustle." Jerome staggered backward, hitting the edge of the credenza behind him. The crystal water pitchers rattled violently against the silver tray. He looked from me to Harrison to the thick black leather portfolio resting on the table. The grand patriarchal illusion he had spent his entire life maintaining shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He was not a powerful king passing down a lucrative empire to his golden son. He was a bankrupt failure standing in a dying warehouse, begging his discarded daughter for pennies. The profound silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of total absolute defeat. They were trapped. They were completely exposed, and I was just getting started. I reached out and slowly opened the heavy cover of the Omni Logistics portfolio, flipping to the very first page of their fraudulent financial records. The crisp sound of heavy paper turning was the only noise in the boardroom. I bypassed the executive summaries and the glossy marketing materials Jerome had undoubtedly spent thousands of dollars to produce. I flipped directly to the raw, unedited financial disclosures that their accounting software had automatically transmitted to the Omni Logistics due diligence team before Uncle Roland had a chance to manually scrub them. I slid a thick stack of printed ledger sheets across the glass table toward Roland. He did not reach for them. He stared at the papers as if they were soaked in poison. "Let us talk about your valuation, Jerome." I began keeping my voice at a smooth conversational volume. "When you pitched this buyout, you claimed the company was sitting on $12 million in liquid operational capital. You projected a 30% growth margin for the upcoming fiscal year based on the expansion of the Miami shipping routes. You presented this firm as a thriving turnkey asset." I paused, letting my eyes drift to my younger brother, who was visibly shrinking into his expensive leather chair. "But that $12 million does not actually exist, does it, Roland? Because starting exactly 6 months ago, right around the time of Jamal and Chloe's lavish wedding, the operational accounts started bleeding cash at an unprecedented, terrifying rate." Roland swallowed hard, refusing to meet my gaze. I tapped my manicured fingernail against a highlighted line on the ledger. "I know you tried to hide it, Roland," I continued. "You shifted the liabilities into the fleet maintenance budgets. You categorized massive capital withdrawals as consulting fees and vendor advances. You spent half a year cooking the books to cover for your nephew's staggering financial illiteracy, but forensic auditing is a standard part of any multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. My team at Omni Logistics dismantled your creative accounting in less than 3 days." Jerome slammed his fist against the table, finding a sudden, desperate burst of false authority. "That is enough, Camille," he shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are violating family trust. You have absolutely no right to sit there and interrogate my chief financial officer. Shut your mouth and close that binder right now." Harrison stepped forward instantly, neutralizing the threat. He did not raise his voice, but the sheer corporate menace in his posture forced Jerome back into his seat. "As the chief executive officer of the acquiring entity, Madam CEO has complete unrestrained legal access to every single financial document your firm submitted during the due diligence period," Harrison stated coldly. "You willingly handed over the keys to your financial vault when you begged Omni Logistics for a bailout. Do not interrupt her again. I did not even look at Jerome. My focus remained entirely on the terrified couple sitting across from me. Let us discuss where that operational capital actually went, I said, turning to the next page in my portfolio. Let us dissect exactly how a vice president with zero logistics experience manages to bankrupt a regional freight empire in 6 months. I pulled out a printed bank statement and slid it directly in front of Chloe. She recoiled slightly, but her eyes betrayed her. She could not help but read the highlighted numbers. $180,000 wired from the commercial fuel reserve account to a luxury automotive dealership in Buckhead. I read aloud, my voice crisp and unforgiving. That was for the brand new imported SUV Chloe currently drives. A vehicle purchased completely in cash using funds meant to secure diesel fuel for our independent contractors. Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic squeaking sound came out. $50,000 withdrawn from the warehouse safety upgrade budget. I continued flipping to the next page. That sum was directly transferred to the most exclusive private country club in Atlanta to cover an expedited couple's membership initiation fee. A membership Jamal insisted he needed for networking, despite having never secured a single commercial contract in his entire life. Chloe's face drained of all remaining color. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with shock. He told me that was his signing bonus, she whispered, her voice trembling. He said Jerome gave him a bonus for stepping up into the executive track. I let out a short, harsh laugh. A signing bonus. He embezzled it, Chloe. He stole commercial funds to finance your lifestyle because his actual salary could not support the aristocratic illusion you both desperately wanted to project. I did not stop there. I pulled out document after document, laying them out on the polished mahogany table like a deck of tarot cards predicting absolute ruin. $85,000 for a 3-week honeymoon in the Maldives diverted from the driver payroll accounts, $40,000 in unauthorized company credit card charges for designer clothes, fine dining, and spa retreats, all neatly categorized by Uncle Roland as client entertainment expenses. Jamal has systematically siphoned over $500,000 out of the operational reserve since he married you, Chloe, I stated, laying down the final piece of evidence. He did not just burn the bridge. He stole the wood to build a mansion he could never afford. Uncle Roland buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, defeated groan. The jig was completely up. He knew that the evidence I had just laid out on the table was enough to trigger a massive federal investigation. If Omni Logistics reported this to the authorities, Jamal would be facing a decade in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement, and Roland, as the enabling chief financial officer, would be sharing a cell right next to him. Jerome looked at his golden boy, his perfect heir, and the absolute horror of the situation finally cracked his arrogant facade. Jamal, is this true? Jerome demanded, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of rage and devastation. Tell me she is lying, Jamal. Tell me you did not steal from our fleet accounts. Jamal shrank back into his chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. I was going to put it back, Dad, he stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. I swear I was going to put it back. We just needed a little help getting started. I thought when the Omni buyout went through, we could just balance the ledgers with the acquisition capital before anyone noticed. You said the buyout would make us filthy rich. I was just taking an advance on my inheritance. An advance on your inheritance? I repeated, letting the sheer pathetic entitlement of his statement hang in the heavy air of the boardroom. You stole the lifeblood of this company to play pretend. But the absolute worst part, Jamal, is that even without your staggering financial crimes, this company is still completely worthless. I closed the portfolio and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass. I looked directly at Jerome, forcing him to face the reality he had ignored for 10 years. You pitched this company as a highly valuable turnkey asset, Jerome, I said, my tone shifting from prosecuting attorney to ruthless industry titan. But Omni Logistics does not buy delivery trucks. We do not buy aging warehouses with a crumbling infrastructure. We buy functional, highly optimized supply chain networks. We buy predictive operational formulas. We buy efficiency. I tapped my index finger against the dark leather cover of my portfolio. The only thing of value in this entire building was the operational architecture I built from scratch. The proprietary logistics algorithms, the predictive weather routing systems, the direct union negotiations. That is what generated your revenue, and I own all of it. I legally hold the copyrights, the licensing rights, and the server access. For 10 years, I let you use my intellectual property for free because I foolishly believed in family loyalty. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over their horrified faces. But Chloe fired me. She revoked my employee access, demanded my laptop, and effectively terminated the licensing agreement. When I walked out of that glass room 75 hours ago, I took the entire operational brain of this company with me. Without my formulas, you do not have a logistics empire. You have a parking lot full of heavy machinery you cannot legally dispatch, and a mountain of commercial debt you cannot possibly repay. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket. My attorneys stepped forward instantly, ready to flank me for the exit. I came here today to formally notify you that Omni Logistics is officially withdrawing its letter of intent to acquire this firm. I announce delivering the final lethal blow to their financial survival. We have determined that your company possesses zero salvageable assets. You are uninvestable. You cannot do this. Chloe's voice shattered the heavy silence of the boardroom. The sound was a shrill, desperate shriek that echoed harshly off the glass walls. She stood up so fast that her heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the floor. You signed a non-compete agreement, Camille. You signed a binding, ironclad corporate non-compete clause when you took the senior operations director position. Chloe slammed her manicured hands flat against the mahogany table, leaning forward with a sudden, frantic surge of false confidence. She looked wildly toward Jerome, seeking his validation. She is in direct violation of her employment contract, Jerome. If she secretly owns a competing logistics firm while employed by us, she breached her fiduciary duty. We can sue her for every single penny she has. We can take Omni Logistics from her in federal court. We own her company. A sudden, sickening wave of hope washed over Jerome's flushed face. His posture straightened as he grabbed onto Chloe's amateur legal assessment like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. She is right, Camille. You are bound by a 10-year executive non-compete. You cannot legally operate a rival logistics holding company within a 500-mile radius of this facility. I am going to tie you up in endless litigation until you surrender every single asset you own to this family. I did not break my composure. I did not flinch at their empty threats. I simply looked at Chloe with a mixture of profound clinical pity and absolute disdain. The sheer unadulterated hubris required to threaten a billionaire CEO with a breach of contract lawsuit was astounding. I reached back into my imported leather briefcase and retrieved a single crisp manila folder. I placed it on the glass surface of the table and slid it with precise, deliberate force. It stopped directly in front of Chloe's trembling hands. "Open it, Chloe." I instructed, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "Read the document inside." Chloe swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Jamal before she reached out and flipped the folder open. Resting inside was the official termination notice she had drafted and forced me to sign just 75 hours ago. Let us review the basics of corporate employment law. I began speaking slowly and clearly so that every single person in the room could comprehend the magnitude of their failure. An executive non-compete clause is a restrictive covenant. It is only legally binding if the terms of the employment contract are strictly honored by the employer. It requires continuous consideration. Consideration usually comes in the form of a proper severance package and vested stock options when an executive is terminated without documented performance-related cause. I watched Chloe's eyes scan the paperwork. I watched the exact moment her breathing stopped. "But what did you do?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You were so desperate to secure Jamal his corner office that you bypassed standard human resources protocols completely. You fired me effective immediately. You claimed I was guilty of unauthorized moonlighting to justify an immediate removal. And then last night at the family dinner, you proudly announced that you had placed an administrative freeze on my severance payout." Uncle Roland let out a soft, horrified gasp from across the table. As the chief financial officer, he instantly recognized the catastrophic legal blunder Chloe had committed. He buried his face in his hands, unable to watch the execution unfold. "You attempted to use my severance package to extort my 15% minority equity." I continued, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "You deliberately withheld my financial compensation, and in doing so, you committed a fatal breach of contract. The very second you locked me out of the payroll system and froze my severance, you completely invalidated my restrictive covenant. You shredded my non-compete agreement yourself." Chloe, you handed me total legal immunity on a silver platter. Jerome slowly turned his head to look at his daughter-in-law. The false hope that had animated his features just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a dark, terrifying rage. He realized that the woman he had allowed to orchestrate my firing had just single-handedly destroyed their only legal leverage. But your staggering incompetence did not end there, Chloe, I stated, refusing to give them a single second to recover. You decided to send a mass email to our entire active client roster, accusing me of gross financial misconduct. You terrified the regional vendors. You made them believe the operational infrastructure of this firm was collapsing due to my criminal activity. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table and locked my gaze onto Jerome. And you were right. The infrastructure was collapsing. But it was collapsing because your golden boy deleted the primary port authority routing codes in Miami this morning. When corporate clients panic, they immediately look for a safe harbor, I explained. They look for operational stability. They look for the one person who has been flawlessly managing their complex supply chains and ensuring their profit margins for the last 10 years. I gestured to Harrison, who stood stoically behind me. Over the last 48 hours, my executive acquisitions team at Omni Logistics has been fielding hundreds of frantic, desperate phone calls from your former clients, the agricultural suppliers in Florida, the automotive manufacturers in Michigan, the massive retail distributors across the eastern seaboard. Jamal clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking with raw terror. "We did not even have to pitch them," I replied smoothly. "We did not have to negotiate or leverage our capital. They begged us to take over their freight contracts. They pleaded with us to absorb their logistics networks, to save their highly perishable inventory from rotting on your disorganized, chaotic loading docks. They knew I was the architect behind their success, and the moment they realized I was running Omni Logistics, they jumped ship without hesitation." I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my biological family. "I am incredibly proud to inform you that over the last 48 hours, Omni Logistics has legally absorbed 90% of your active client contracts. I delivered the final lethal blow, watching their entire world shatter into dust. Every single one of your major vendors has formally severed their ties with this warehouse. They have all signed exclusive multi-year routing agreements with my holding company." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and completely final. The air in the boardroom felt entirely depleted of oxygen. "You currently have zero incoming freight, Jerome," I stated coldly. "You have no operational revenue. You have no clients. What you do have is a mountain of commercial debt. A vice president who actively embezzled $500,000 to fund his country club lifestyle, and a human resources director who just exposed you to a massive corporate defamation lawsuit by sending a lealess email across state lines." I picked up my imported leather briefcase. My 3 corporate attorneys seamlessly parted to clear a path toward the heavy glass doors. "Your empire is gone, Jerome, and you handed it to me for absolutely nothing." I did not walk out immediately. I stood just inches from the heavy glass doors, feeling the cool, conditioned air circulating through the room, and watched the shockwave detonate across the mahogany table. The complete withdrawal of Omni Logistics from the acquisition agreement did not just mean a lost payday for my parents. It triggered a catastrophic automatic financial default. Jerome had aggressively secured their massive commercial operating loans, using the impending corporate buyout as his primary leverage. The banks had only extended their lines of credit because they believed my holding company was about to inject tens of millions of dollars into their accounts. Without that signed letter of intent and without the 90% of the client roster, I had just legally absorbed the banking algorithms would flag their accounts for immediate total liquidation before the end of the business day. They were not just broke, they were facing a multi-million-dollar negative balance that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Uncle Roland was the first to completely break under the crushing pressure. The quiet, enabling chief financial officer, who had spent a decade smoothing over my father's reckless gambles and my brother's staggering incompetence, suddenly snapped. He stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair tipped backward and slammed into the glass wall behind him. His face was a terrifying shade of purple, and his breathing was erratic. He pointed a shaking finger directly across the table at Jamal. "Do you understand what you have done?" Roland roared, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. The commercial bridge loans were tied directly to the client retention clauses. The banks are going to seize everything. They are going to seize the warehouse, the delivery trucks, and our personal residential estates. My entire retirement is tied up in this firm. You destroyed us because of you. Because you had to steal $500,000 to play a big-shot executive when you do not even know how to balance a basic spreadsheet. Jerome stared at his brother in absolute horror and then slowly turned his heavy gaze toward his only son. The patriarchal protection, the blind, unconditional adoration that had shielded Jamal his entire life, evaporated in a single instant. Jerome realized that the golden child had not just made a clerical error or a poor management decision. Jamal had actively, systematically robbed him blind. You stole from the fleet reserves, Jerome demanded, his voice, a low, dangerous rumble that shook the very foundation of the room. I handed you the keys to this empire, and you gutted it to buy country club memberships and luxury cars. You looked me in the eye and told me the fuel accounts were stable while you were draining them to fund your own lavish lifestyle. Jamal threw his hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender, his voice pitched high, squeaking with pure terror. Dad, I was going to fix it. Chloe needed the SUV to match the other wives in Buckhead. She said we needed to project massive financial success so the board of directors would respect my authority. I was doing it for the family image. You always said image was everything. You taught me to fake it until I made it. Chloe recoiled as if Jamal had just physically struck her across the face. The white sister-in-law, who had marched into my office and fired me with such smug, unearned satisfaction, was now watching her entire aristocratic illusion burn to ash. She had married into this family specifically for the wealth, the elite status, and the unearned power. She thought she had secured a golden ticket to high society. Finding out that her husband was not a wealthy corporate heir, but a desperate, bumbling embezzler facing a federal prison sentence, completely shattered her pristine facade. Do not you dare put this on me, Jamal. Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the soundproof glass walls. You told me you were a multimillionaire. You told me you were inheriting a regional empire. You are nothing but a pathetic fraud. You dragged me into this mess, and you made me send that defamatory email to the clients. You made me commit corporate leal for a company that does not even have a functioning bank account to pay my salary. We are married, Chloe, Jamal begged, tears actually streaming down his face as he reached across the mahogany table, grasping for her hand. We are a team. We are going to have a baby. We can figure this out together. I can fix this. Chloe snatched her hand back with absolute revulsion, wiping her fingers on her designer skirt as if his touch had contaminated her. I am not going down with a sinking ship. She spat, her eyes wild with panic and a furious survival instinct. I am not going to federal prison because you do not know how to run a logistics firm. My father is an attorney. I am calling him the exact second I walk out of this building, and I am filing for an immediate annulment. You are dead to me. With a swift, violent motion, Chloe grabbed her left hand. She yanked the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger, the very same ring that Jamal had undoubtedly purchased using the stolen payroll funds from the warehouse truck drivers. She reared back and threw the heavy jewelry directly at his chest. The sharp diamond struck Jamal hard against the lapel of his custom-tailored suit before clattering loudly onto the glass surface of the table and spinning off the edge where it vanished into the commercial carpet. It is over, Jamal, Chloe said, her voice dripping with pure, unfiltered venom. You are entirely broke. You are going to jail, and I am completely done with you. She did not even glance at Vivian or Jerome. She grabbed her expensive leather handbag, turned on her heel, and stormed past me toward the exit doors. I did not move a single inch to accommodate her exit. Chloe had to press her back flat against the glass wall and suck in her breath to squeeze past my corporate attorneys. Her face was flushed dark red with extreme humiliation and rage as she fled the boardroom, abandoning the family she had tried so hard to control. I stood perfectly still, watching Jamal drop to his hands and knees on the floor. He was frantically, desperately searching the carpet for the discarded diamond ring. He was weeping openly, reduced to a pathetic, scrambling child, searching for a shiny object in the absolute wreckage of his own making. The golden boy, the rightful heir, was crawling on his hands and knees in a bankrupt warehouse. Vivian finally broke her stunned, terrified silence. She let out a long, agonizing wail, covering her face with both hands, as she watched her perfect, flawless family spontaneously combust right before her eyes. Her lifelong dream of a powerful corporate dynasty of endless country club luncheons and elite society galas was definitively dead. The reality that she had sacrificed her highly competent daughter to protect a lying, thieving son finally crushed the breath out of her. Jerome slumped heavily into his large executive chair, burying his head in his arms. He was completely, fundamentally broken by the harsh reality that his own extreme arrogance and his blind, unyielding favoritism had destroyed everything he had spent 30 years building. They had turned on each other like cornered wild animals the exact moment the money disappeared. The golden illusion was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth behind. I did not say another word. There was absolutely nothing left to say. I reached out and pulled the heavy black leather Omni Logistics portfolio across the polished mahogany table. I picked it up and slid it smoothly back into my imported briefcase. The sharp metallic snap of the brass locks engaging echoed through the devastated boardroom like a judge slamming a gavel. The verdict was final. I picked up the briefcase by its sturdy handle. I gave a subtle nod to Harrison and my 3 corporate attorneys. They immediately pivoted, forming a protective wall behind me. As I turned my back on my biological family, I walked toward the heavy glass doors without a single backward glance. I left them drowning in the suffocating reality of their own catastrophic failures. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the carpeted hallway of the executive floor. The air outside the boardroom instantly felt lighter, cooler, and completely free of the toxic, suffocating pressure I had carried on my shoulders for the last 10 years. My heels clicked a steady rhythmic tempo against the floorboards, leading my legal team directly toward the main elevator bank. We were halfway down the corridor when the chaotic sounds of panic erupted behind us. I heard the heavy glass doors of the boardroom violently crash open, hitting the wall stops with a jarring thud. Then came the frantic, desperate sound of running footsteps. It was a sound I had never once heard in my entire life. Jerome and Vivian did not run. They summoned people. They commanded people to come to them. The sheer thought of my proud, arrogant parents physically running down a hallway to chase someone was entirely unprecedented. Camille, wait. The voice was ragged, breathless, and completely stripped of all its patriarchal authority. It was Jerome. He was shouting my name, but it sounded more like a desperate plea for a life raft. I did not slow my pace. I kept walking, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked on the stainless steel elevator doors waiting at the end of the hall. Camille, please stop. You have to listen to me. Have I reached the elevator bank and pressed the call button? The circular indicator light flared a brilliant green. I turned around, slowly facing the long corridor. Jerome and Vivian were practically sprinting toward me. My father was red in the face, his expensive tie slightly askew, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. Vivian was right beside him, struggling to run in her designer heels, her perfectly styled hair falling loose around her shoulders. The pristine aristocratic facade they had maintained for decades had completely dissolved, leaving behind 2 terrified aging people who suddenly realized they were about to lose their mansion, their country club status, and their entire financial existence. Harrison and my 3 attorneys immediately stepped forward, forming a solid physical barricade between me and my approaching parents. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their dark suits presenting a formidable wall of corporate defense. Jerome stopped just inches away from the attorneys, holding his hands up in a placating, frantic gesture. Camille, you cannot just walk away like this, he gasped, his eyes wide and pleading. You proved your point. You showed us who holds the real power. We see it now. We respect it. Just come back into the boardroom. We can restructure the entire hierarchy right now. I will strip Jamal of his title today. I will fire him. I will hand you the presidency of the family firm. You can have total operational control. Whatever you want, Camille. Name your price. Just do not cancel the buyout. I looked at the man who had spent 35 years making me feel completely invisible. He was literally offering to sacrifice his golden boy, the son he had just toasted as the future of his legacy to save his own bank accounts. It was the ultimate display of his pure transactional nature. You have absolutely nothing I want, Jerome, I stated, my voice radiating a cold, absolute certainty. You cannot offer me the presidency of a company that currently has 0 revenue and millions in commercial debt. Your firm is not an asset. It is a toxic liability. And I do not buy liabilities. Jerome let out a broken, desperate sound, shaking his head frantically. You know I will lose the house, Camille. The banks will seize everything. I will have to declare bankruptcy at 65 years old. You cannot do this to me. I gave you your start in this industry. I gave you your first job. You owe me this buyout. You gave me a job, paying half of what I was worth, so you could use my labor to fund your son's extravagant mistakes. I corrected him smoothly. You took my youth, and you exploited my loyalty. I owe you absolutely nothing. You are going to lose the house because you leveraged it to cover Jamal's embezzlement. That is your consequence to bear. Vivian pushed past Jerome, shoving her way to the very front of the barricade. Her face was streaked with running mascara. Real, genuine tears were pouring down her cheeks. For my entire life, Vivian had used tears as a calculated weapon of emotional manipulation. She would cry to make me feel guilty for working late. She would cry to force me into attending family functions I hated. She would cry to play the victim whenever I tried to establish a basic boundary. I looked at her tears now and felt an incredible, profound emptiness. They held no power over me anymore. The spell was completely broken. Camille, look at me. Vivian sobbed, her voice cracking with raw emotional devastation. She pressed her hands against her chest, taking a step closer to the wall of lawyers. Please look at your mother. We were wrong. We were so incredibly wrong. We let Chloe get into our heads. We thought Jamal was ready, but he was not. We made a terrible mistake, but you are our daughter. We are your family. You cannot just destroy us and walk away. A soft chime echoed through the hallway. The heavy stainless steel doors of the executive elevator slid open behind me. Harrison turned his head slightly, indicating the car was ready. I took a step backward, moving toward the open elevator cab. Vivian saw me retreating and pure visceral panic took over. She lunged forward. Slipping past the shoulder of one of my attorneys, she reached out, her hands trembling violently, and grabbed tightly onto the sleeve of my tailored charcoal suit. Her grip was desperate, her nails digging through the expensive fabric as if she could physically drag me back into the prison I had just escaped. Camille, please, Vivian wailed, her voice echoing shrilly down the empty corridor. We are your parents. You cannot do this to your family. We raised you. We gave you everything. You have to save us. I stopped moving. I looked down at the heavily jeweled hand clutching my arm. I looked at the knuckles white with desperate tension. I did not yell. I did not jerk my arm away in a panic. I simply reached over with my free hand, covered her trembling fingers with my own, and physically peeled her grip off my sleeve. I brushed her hand away, pushing it back toward her with a firm, deliberate motion. I smoothed out the invisible wrinkles on my suit jacket, looking my weeping mother directly in the eye. I delivered my final icy boundary, ensuring every single word struck with absolute lethal precision. You did not raise a daughter, I said, my voice ringing with undeniable finality. You raised a safety net for your son, but the net just cut itself loose. Have a nice life. I turned my back on them and stepped into the pristine interior of the elevator. Harrison and the 3 attorneys stepped in immediately after me, turning to face the hallway. Jerome was holding Vivian up as her knees literally gave out beneath her. She was sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands, completely broken by the absolute reality of her own destruction. Jerome stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow, stripped of every last ounce of his pride and his power. I stood perfectly straight in the center of the elevator, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my expression completely impassive. I did not offer them a parting glance of pity. I did not show a single ounce of remorse. I simply watched them stand in the ruins of the empire they had burned down themselves. The automated voice of the elevator chimed softly. The heavy stainless steel doors began to glide shut. The gap narrowed, closing off the sound of my mother's desperate weeping. The doors clamped tightly together, sealing with a solid metallic click. The connection was permanently severed. The elevator engaged smoothly, and I began my rapid descent, leaving the ashes of my former family far behind me. 6 months can feel like a single breath or an entire lifetime, depending on which side of the glass you are standing on. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The morning sun was casting a brilliant golden glow across the city. It was a Tuesday. 10 years ago, I would have been standing on a freezing loading dock, drinking burnt coffee, and screaming at a freight dispatcher to fix one of my brother's massive routing errors. Today, my biggest operational concern was deciding which international shipping conglomerate Omni Logistics was going to acquire next. The implosion of my biological family was swift, absolute, and entirely public. When you build an empire on a foundation of lies and unpaid commercial debt, gravity eventually collects its due. The banking algorithms performed exactly as I knew they would. Within 24 hours of Omni Logistics officially withdrawing from the buyout, the creditors seized everything. The liquidation of the family business was a brutal, highly televised affair. The banks did not just freeze the corporate accounts. They locked the warehouse gates and auctioned off the entire fleet of delivery trucks to the highest bidders to recoup their massive losses. I know this because my acquisitions team attended the auction and purchased 30 of their best refrigerated trailers for pennies on the dollar. We integrated them into our own fleet by the end of the week. Uncle Roland tried to negotiate a plea deal with the federal investigators, but there was simply no way to hide the sheer volume of financial crimes he had committed.